My name is Jim Estes. I'm a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And in this series of lectures, I'm explaining the importance of large apex predators to the way that our global ecosystems work. I started out in part one giving you a conceptual overview of what the questions were and broadly the way that we have looked at those questions and tried to answer them. In part two, I told you a particular story about what we have learned from one specific system, and that is the system that involves sea otters and kelp forests in the North Pacific Ocean. And now in this third and final module or part to my lecture, I'm going to expand this to other species and other ecosystems and ask the question in general, to what degree do the sorts of things that we have seen in the sea otter kelp forest system apply to other species of predators and other ecosystems around the world? The outline for this part of the talk will essentially be this. I'm going to give you a number of vignettes of other particular species and systems around the world, and then at the end I'm going to wrap it all up. So those vignettes are going to involve the gray wolf and boreal forests in North America. They're going to involve large carnivores in Africa and the tropical savanna system. They will third we will go to the great sharks and the effects of great sharks. And then I'll give you a very brief overview, a pictorial overview of how different systems look with and without species, other particular systems around the world. From there, I'll go to a recap and some general conclusions, and that will wrap up the lecture. So let's begin with gray wolves in boreal forests. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's very important to modularize these food webs because they're very complex, and so it's important to focus on a smaller group of species that we can actually monitor and see process with. And in this particular case, it will be the wolves as apex predators, elk as the things that wolves eat. Elk are herbivores, which eat plants, and then we'll also be talking about a number of other plant-associated species. I mentioned at the beginning of my series of lectures that these systems must be perturbed in order for one to be able to see species interactions. In this particular case, the perturbation has been the removal and then repatriation of wolves to North America. Much of what I'm going to be telling you about is work that was done not by me or my lab, but by Bill Ripple at Oregon State University. So this is a photograph taken somewhere in the Intermountain West during the wintertime of elk. And what you see are lots of elk. You see a few trees in the background, and all of the trees that you see in this picture are old trees. And the reason for that is that the elk are such intensive herbivores in this system that all of the young trees are no longer able to survive elk browsing. And we know this from experimental work that's been done in which elk have been excluded from areas of habitat. You see here a picture of a fence that's been built around some area where elk browse. And on the left, you can see that within the fenced area, aspen trees are growing, and outside of the fenced area, they're not. So elk are very important herbivores in this system. And when they're sufficiently abundant, they have a strong depressing effect on plants, very much like the sea urchins have a depressing effect on the kelps. Here's a photograph taken somewhere in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone. The panel on the left was shot 20+ years ago before the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone. And the panel on the right is that very same place, as you can see from the tree in the background. Some years later, after wolves have been reintroduced into the system, and what you see here is a flush of willows and growth of woody vegetation as a consequence of the effect that wolves are having on the elk and the release of herbivory by elk on willows in this particular case as a consequence of wolves being in the system. Time series of data from Yellowstone show a variety of other sorts of things that have been going on during this period of time. So if you look at the various panels starting from the upper left in this illustration, the data at the top left shows what's happened to wolves with their reintroduction and increase. The panel below that shows how elk have declined over the same period of time. The various panels below that show how other components of the ecosystem have changed, such as the intensity of grazing and so on and so forth. The wolf-elk plant trophic cascade also has spin-off effects on other species and ecological processes. The first one I'm going to tell you about some work that's been done showing a link between this interaction among wolves, elk, and berry-producing shrubs, and grizzly bears, which also feed on berries. So these are some experimental data from a variety of plots in which elk have been excluded by fencing, and you can see that in areas where elk have been excluded, the production of berries is very much higher than in places where elk have free access. As a consequence of that, if you look through time at the proportion of fruit in the diets of grizzly bears, you see how that relates very strongly to elk abundance. So when elk, and that's shown in the panel to the lower right, when elk are abundant in the system, berries are quite rare in the diet of the bears, and when elk are less and less abundant, berries become more and more important to grizzly bears. So here's an example of how the wolf-elk plant trophic cascade is actually having a knock-on effect on another species. I want to tell you about another one of these potential knock-on effects, and that has to do with coyotes and Lyme disease. So coyotes co-occur in an overlap in their habitat with wolves, but wolves have a depressing effect on coyotes. So when wolves are reintroduced or recover in areas or when they disappear, coyote populations change in abundance in an associated way. When wolves become more abundant, coyotes become more rare. When wolves become less abundant, coyotes increase. In certain parts of their range, and in particular in the Midwest and eastern United States, coyotes interact with red foxes. Red foxes, in turn, interact and prey on small mammals. So when coyotes are abundant, red foxes are rare. When coyotes are rare, red foxes are abundant. And the impact that interaction between coyotes and red foxes has on small mammals follows, just like any other trophic cascade. But when coyotes are abundant, small mammals are abundant. When coyotes are rare, small mammals are rare because of the intermediate effect of foxes. Foxes are important in the system because they have a limiting effect on small mammals, and small mammals are important in the system, the Lyme disease system, because they are a critical blood meal resource for black-legged ticks or deer ticks, which are the host of Lyme disease. So when small mammal populations become abundant, Lyme disease becomes more prevalent in the system because there are more ticks, and thus the ticks both transmit the disease back among one another, and they have a much higher probability of transmitting the disease to human beings when they're abundant in the system. So what's the empirical evidence for this? Well, most of the empirical evidence comes from a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science a couple of years ago by Tal Levy and his associates. And what you see in this illustration from their paper is the long-term trends in the abundance of deer, which are across the top, the abundance of coyotes, which are in the middle set of panels, and the abundance of fox, which are in the lower panels. And what they see in this accumulation of these long time series is very strong co-relationships between Lyme disease and both coyotes and fox abundance, but an inconsistent relationship with deer. So as a consequence of these various studies that have been done, we can see that gray wolves actually have a variety of strong knock-on effects in this system in places that we might not have ever expected to see them. We can see that wolves have an effect on coyotes, which in turn has an effect on the prevalence of Lyme disease. I've told you that story. We see that wolves have an effect on elk, which has a knock-on effect on vegetation, which in turn influences a lot of different things. It influences breeding habitat for small birds, and it involves things like berry production and the effect that that has on grizzly bears. I've told you about that particular story in detail. It also has effect on pronghorn antelope survival. One might expect that wolves would be bad for pronghorns, but in turn, it in fact turns out that wolves are beneficial to pronghorns because what they do is they run off the coyotes, and the coyotes prey selectively on the pronghorn fawns. And so when wolves are in the system, they actually reduce the mortality rate on newborn fawns in pronghorn and thus increase their populations. We have seen, or people that have worked on this system have seen, strong effects on riparian habitat and on water tables associated with this interaction, because when there's a lot of willow, a lot of plant material in the low-lying habitats, the water table is higher than it is when this vegetation has been lost. So the wolf has effects that cascade through this system in a whole variety of different ways. That's the wolf story. Now I want to move to another continent. I'm going to go to Africa, to tropical Africa, and we're going to look at what is known about large carnivores in that system. In this particular system, the modules of the food web that we're interested in are large predatory mammals, baboons, which are actually preyed upon by some of these large predatory mammals, plants and small vertebrates, which are consumed by baboons, and then various other parts of the system that are linked to plants and small vertebrates. The carnivores in this system are not just a single species like the wolf in North America, but a number of species. And in the particular case that I'm going to explain to you about, there are 4 species that are key. One is the African lion, another is a leopard, another is the wild dog in the lower left, and the final important carnivore species in this system is the spotted hyena in the lower right. The perturbation that has allowed people to see the dynamics of this food web and the importance of predators is the large-scale decline of predators through time across Africa, and data that have been gathered in association with that decline. This is work that's been done largely by my friend and colleague Justin Broussard at the University of California at Berkeley. Much of the work was done in Ghana, shown here. And this is a picture that really characterizes the important predator-prey interaction. It shows lions on the ground and baboons in the trees, and when there are a lot of lions or big predators around, this is what baboons do. They spend a lot of time off the ground, because if they don't, they get eaten. This shows what's happened to large carnivores in one particular place where there are good data. This is a characterization of much of Africa. And what one can see here is that over the last 40 or 50 years, the abundance of large carnivores has declined by an order of magnitude. As a consequence of that, baboon numbers have increased and baboon behavior has changed. So baboons no longer spend most of their time up in the trees. They come down onto the ground a lot more. And in addition to coming down onto the ground, not only do they feed on fruits and plants, which is what they do when there are a lot of predators in the system, but they become omnivorous. That is, they feed not only on fruits and other plant materials, but they feed on a variety of animals. So through all of this, the people that have worked on this system have shown this complex series of interactions among the large carnivores of Africa, the negative effect that those large carnivores have on baboons, and the knock-on effects that the baboons have on not only plants, but small ungulates, small birds, other small primates. The baboons actually have a depressing effect on these various species. And the baboons have an enhancement effect on an exotic tree. And in this particular case, it's a neem tree. Neem tree has been introduced into Africa. The neem tree is an interesting plant because it contains a lot of toxic compounds that are used for medicinal purposes. So humans use these plants for various sorts of medicines that help counteract various sicknesses and diseases. But as a consequence of all of these toxic compounds and the fact that the baboons have facilitated the spread of neem trees, the insects that feed on plants have been very affected, and in particular butterflies. So butterfly populations have been significantly depressed in these areas as a result of the loss of lions, as a result of the knock-on effect of the increase in baboons, and as a result of the knock-on effect of that, of the increase in neem trees and the increased toxicity of the various plants that the butterflies would otherwise be feeding on and that would be fueling their populations. So we see these complex interactions going from species or across species that we might not otherwise expect would be affected by large predators. This predator-prey interaction between large carnivores and baboons also has effects directly on humans or indirectly on humans, and in one particular case, hookworm. So hookworm is a species of parasite that infects both humans and baboons. And where lions are lost from the system, the overlap between baboons and people increases, and that overlap between people and baboons increases the frequency of hookworm disease both in baboons and in people as a result of the overlap and the interaction between the two species. The impact of lions on African ecosystems doesn't stop with hookworm, but it also extends to human social systems. One of the things that has happened as a consequence of the increase in baboons and the overlap of baboons with rural human societies in Africa is that agricultural conflicts have increased tremendously as a result of the increased numbers of baboons. And as a consequence of that, many African families are now holding their children out of school to help them protect their crops from raiding baboons. So this is having an impact on the degree to which these children have any hope of actually developing educations. I'm going to now move to the third module, which is now back into the ocean, and I'm going to talk about great sharks and some work that was done in this particular case by Ransom Myers and his associates on the effects of sharks on coastal ecosystems. The module of this food web that I'm going to focus on is the great sharks as the apex predators, small sharks and rays, which are fed on by the large predatory sharks, and bivalve mollusks, clams and oysters and a variety of other species of bivalves that are fed on by the small sharks and rays. The perturbation in this particular case that has provided a window into understanding the effects of sharks in this system has simply been the overexploitation and depletion of sharks and the time series of data that people have gathered on the abundance of sharks, the abundance of small sharks and rays, and on the abundance of bivalves. This is a figure that comes from the paper that Ransom Myers and his colleagues published in Science in 2007. And there are a lot of data here, and it's a little bit complicated to look at. I want to draw your attention just to the trend lines in each of these panels. So this top series of panels, labeled on the left, Great Sharks, shows the best fit of projections, functional projections, to all of the data on shark abundance for a number of species of great sharks in estuaries of the eastern United States. And you can see in all cases, there's a very substantial declining trend through time. The bottom series of panels, the central series of panels are data from a variety of species of small sharks and rays. And what you can see in this particular case is that in contrast to the great sharks, which are all declining, all of these species of small sharks and rays are increasing over the same time period. And then the single bottom panel shows data on the abundance of one particular bivalve mollusk, and that's the bay scallop, for which there's actually a commercial and recreational fishery. And you can see that in this particular case, the abundance of these mollusks has declined very markedly over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's clearly the consequence of the overexploitation or increased exploitation of those mollusks by small sharks and rays. That has been demonstrated experimentally repeatedly in a number of different places. So here we have a case where we've got a trophic cascade, again, which is shown in cartoon form in the magenta box in the upper right, where the great sharks are having a depleting effect on small sharks and rays and skates, and that in turn is releasing the benthic bottom-living bivalve mollusks from limitation by predation. So I've given you brief vignettes on several different systems to demonstrate that the processes that I discussed and demonstrated in my more extensive treatment of the sea otter kelp forest system, that these occur in for other species and other systems around the world. Now I want to just show you a series of photographs, and what these are pictures from a paper that my colleagues and I published in Science in 2011 from various different systems around the world, where you get a visual view of how different these places look when predators are present versus when predators are absent. And I'm not going to run through every one of them. I'll pick out a couple of them just to illustrate the points. Some of them are ones you've already seen. But if, for example, you take the third panel down on the left, you'll see a lake. And that lake actually had a partition put in it. And on the left side of that partition, all of the predatory fish were removed. And on the right side of the partition, they were left intact. And what you see in this particular case, which is what we see in many different other systems with large predators, is that the clarity of that water, the whole ecosystem has changed its visual aspect. So on the left, where the large fish have been removed, you see the water has turned green, whereas on the right, where the large fish were left the water remains very clear. Why is that? It's because we have a trophic cascade that runs from large predatory fish to planktivorous fish to zooplankton to phytoplankton. And as a consequence of the loss of large predatory fish, the limiting force on these phytoplankton is relaxed, and that has caused these lakes to turn green. I talked about the knock-on effects of apex predators on other dimensions to nature. And what I've done in this penultimate slide is simply given you a schematic that shows ecological entities or processes from the natural world that are known to be affected by the interaction between apex predators, their prey, and other species. So starting from the top and working your way around, and some of this you've already seen examples of, we see impacts of apex predators on soil quality. We see impacts of apex predators on water quality. We see impacts on disease. We see impacts on fire. We see impacts on the atmosphere. We see impacts of ecological impacts of apex predators on other elements of the ecosystem that spread very widely to other physical and biological elements of nature that we live in. And in many cases, these indirect effects of apex predators on other components of the ecosystem bear very directly on human welfare. So if it's not just ecology that you're interested in, but how ecology influences people and human welfare, these are things that are important to us. So wrapping up on this third component of my lecture, some of the general conclusions that we can draw from what I've told you. Large predators are ecologically important, and this occurs in diverse ecosystems. These particular influences of apex predators extend broadly across nature to numerous other species and ecological processes. And the ecological influences of large predators lead to a whole array of impacts that impinge on human welfare. This is work that I've told you about that's been done in collaboration by other people or in collaboration with other people. I've listed the collaborators on the left and the sources of support on the right. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that my lecture has given you some window into the importance of large apex predators to the structure and function of the world we live in. Thank you.